Good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning on the West Coast, and hello to SFS alumni from around the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and I'm thrilled to be back for another Fast Break, a repeat performance by Professor Marc Busch. He's the Karl Landegger Professor of International Business Diplomacy at SFS. He is our resident trade expert. He is no stranger to this Fast Break series, as we've had a number of events to cover in this never-ending saga of trade and tariffs. Just so you know, Marc has really played a major role in the decision we're about to discuss. In fact, he co-authored the amicus brief with the law school, Georgetown own law school appellate clinic that supported the effort to challenge the Trump tariffs. We have also another Georgetown person who's played a major role, Neil Katyal, the GULC law professor, argued the case at the Supreme Court. And I'm pleased to actually say that there was student input as well. And in fact, the amicus brief included some juniors who contributed into this amicus brief. Marc is also well known across the trade community. He does a biweekly piece on trade for The Hill. He's been an advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative of the Department of Commerce, and he teaches an innovative course called the Trade Lab, which gets our students deeply involved in trade disputes, of which there are plenty at the moment. Welcome, Marc. It's good to have you. Marc, in one of our last Fast Break sessions, you did mention that you thought this Supreme Court decision was going to go the way it did. And what I am going to ask you is, were there any surprises in the decision? What has sort of surprised you in the decision?
I wasn't surprised by the verdict. I had bet 7-2. It turned out to be 6-3. I was getting a little worried when I heard on the street from smart people that it was going to be closer to 5-4. But 6-3 is a nice midway point, and that certainly was welcome. I was surprised, however, by how the three so-called liberal jurists got to the six. The idea being that they really just wanted common sense argument about what regulate importation meant. They didn't need to engage in major questions doctrine, which is, of course, what Katyal argued, that unless there is a clear and unwavering delegation of a given power to tax in this case, that Congress made to the executive, that the executive couldn't claim the right to tax versus what Congress has as its Article 1 obligation. So here you had some interesting kind of angles on how to arrive at a 6-3 majority. You had Roberts writing for the majority, explaining major questions. You had the three liberal jurists saying, we don't need it. And then you had Gorsuch writing a master Federalist paper like expose on why everyone should get back together and agree on a common path. What wasn't there was what we all loved in the appeals court, and for that matter, at the Court of International Trade, the two lower courts that were affirmed by the Supreme Court. There was no mention of other statutes. There was no big discussion of, in fact, what Trump is backfilling his lost tariffs with right now. There was no real elaboration of the drafting history of these other statutes, which undoubtedly we're going to talk about now. So, in a way, a 170-page document more so on how you get to the conclusion than the essence of the conclusion vis-a-vis some of the other statutes that we're hearing rolled off the tongues of every single trade watcher in DC.
Well, thanks for that. And I want to remind our guests here at the webinar that they can add some questions into the Q&A function, which I will be monitoring during the course of the half-hour conversation that we have here. And I will try to bring in some of those questions into the conversation itself. And in fact, just related to that, it is a somewhat unusual coalition in the court, given some Trump appointees and traditional conservative jurists, as well as the traditional liberal jurists. Do you any sort of insights from the discussion, from the engagement itself, of what was driving essentially the conservative justices to have this unusual kind of coalition on what is really being seen as, perhaps one of the most important decisions of this administration, certainly, if not much longer?
It was really separation of powers. It was the overarching theme. There was going to be very little questioning about it. And for that matter, along with Jennifer Hillman at the Georgetown Law Center, I had written several pieces before explaining why it was that we were going to see the Supreme Court, unlike the two lower courts, fixate on separation of powers. And they did. And that's what carried the day with the conservative jurists. And even the dissent was hard pressed to come up with a story about why it was that the president should be allowed to tax, other than that foreign policy should lead to greater deference despite major questions. And in that regard, it's almost as though the dissent was looking for a way to deviate while nonetheless still equipping the Supreme Court with the weaponry it would need in the future to dismantle something that went a little too far. So, not this too far, but maybe a later too far. And in that regard, the dissent looks a little detached from the six. The six are wildly in on this action about regulate importation and how regulate is not a synonym for taxation. That's it. That's it. And in that regard, it's almost as though the majority, the concurrence, and the dissent are just not looking at the same case.
Okay, well, there are two aspects of the decision, and then we're going to get to the aftermath of the decision that were mentioned, and I'm curious as to what you make of them. One is the issue of the explicit mention that he can reconstitute these tariffs through other means. And what is the significance of the fact that that was brought up in the decision? Was that a signaling of how the court might look at future challenges? And the second, I want to put two out there, which was something that was not mentioned, which was the refund issue, which was very clearly and almost explicitly not mentioned. What can you tell us about those two aspects of the decision?
Footnote 4, the Roberts majority explains that there are other statutes out there and he's not touching it, and he didn't. And nothing about the ruling really illuminates some of the alternative statutes that could be used to backfill. The Kavanaugh dissent certainly hints at other things and hints at the mess that you're describing with respect to the refund. But when you compare it to, say, the Court of Appeals ruling, which was going deep into these alternative statutes, they didn't do that at the Supreme Court. This is not an elaboration of the balance of payments route. This is not an elaboration of the enforcement route. This is not an elaboration of the national security route. In the appeals court, that was really important to set the lane in which IEPA could potentially drive. And to circumscribe that lane was crucial at the Court of Appeals. This separation of powers angle didn't make that as crucial as it had been before. And as a result, it really comes down to regulate is not a synonym for tax. On the refund issue, no one expected the Supreme Court to show us the way forward. It's also important to keep in mind that the Department of Justice didn't give us any reason to really quibble about that. They had said after the Court of Appeals, which stayed the refund, that, look, we've got the money and we'll pay it back with interest. And in fact, Neil Katyal's editorial in the Washington Post today says, okay, live up to those terms, start paying back. You said you would. That's not a signaling or negotiating tactic. That was the federal government's promise. That's why the Court of Appeals stayed the refund issue at that moment. So now all of a sudden, we're going back. You saw FedEx filing a lawsuit at the Court of International Trade. Others are going to follow. And that's a really interesting political narrative, too, because this idea that foreign pays the tariffs and domestic doesn't has been blown out of the water by the fact that we are now nearing, I think, 2,000 plaintiffs arguing, pay us our money back.
Well, look, I'm going to get into what the implications of the decision are for kind of future tariff policy for refunds, but let's start now on what it means for tariffs going forward. We know that the president has used the powers. I'm going to ask you not to refer to all the many sections that he's going to be able to use here. We've got section 122, 301, 232, 338, but just give us the broad architecture of where you think the administration has been preparing for this for some time, presumably. They moved very quickly on the blanket provision of a 10% tariff, even though Trump then later said 15%, but it went back to 10%. And he's got a lot of other, if you will, ammunition in his toolkit to perhaps not only restore tariffs, but actually even to make even more extreme his use of tariff policies. But all these tariff policies of these other sections have a variety of, let's say, sand in the wheels or transaction costs, or you want to, however you want to describe them. Tell us a little bit how you think tariff policy is going to play out from here on in.
The tariff policy was set in motion in anticipation of the ruling by the Supreme Court. It didn't catch the administration by surprise, that's for sure. And they have been planning to roll out this balance of payments weapon called Section 122. And we had all imagined that this would be the first recourse, and it was. No surprise there. The only surprise had been that he could have started at 15. Instead, he started at 10, went to 15, and now he's back down to 10, largely because of his trade deals. He's got a problem there because he gave certain terms to some countries, worse terms to other countries. And at 15, he's going to make more losers than winners. That's going to lead to a lot of renegotiation. You're already seeing pushback by a lot of foreign trade partners who are saying, we got the raw end of this deal and we need to go and rethink what's happening, including the EU, by the way. The problem for Trump with the balance of payments tariffs is that they're already going to be challenged. In fact, I guess it's going today. And is this really a balance of payments crisis? Now, this goes back to the legislating history behind Section 122, which really was a once in a lifetime reprieve for Nixon when he went off the gold standard. And so the mystery going forward is there a possibility of massaging a persistent goods trade deficit into the narrative about balance of payments problem? It's going to be tough. There is a strong bivariate correlation. And depending on what you mean by balance of payments, it's going to be tough slogging for the president. Moreover, think about the political messaging that has to come along with certain of the criteria to check off if you use the statute. You've got to essentially say that the U.S. is incapable of paying some of its bills, that the exchange rate is crashing and things like that. Not exactly a great sell at this particular moment when affordability is top of mind for American consumers looking at the midterm elections, and our foreign trade partners are beginning to doubt U.S. credibility as someone with which to negotiate. And the biggest problem is that they only go on for 150 days, and Congress has already made it pretty clear that they're not renewing after 150 days. So unless the president has a trick up his sleeve to renew on his own after 150 days, he's going to have to go on to something else. That
Can you
leaves him.
just let me kind of get a pin in that point because I think it's important. How serious is that congressional or how stable really is the congressional opposition now that obviously he lost the case, that this is going to be a very, very high profile test of presidential power. Is he going to put enormous pressure on Congress after the 150 days? I assume everyone knows that these Section 122 balance of payments tariffs are only allowed for 150 days without congressional approval. You're saying that there might be a legal challenge even within the 150 days, but then after the 150 days, it's up to Congress. Are you sure that Congress is going to say, we're not going to take this up?
It's hard to say for sure, but there's already enough voices aside from the 6 Republicans who voted against the Canada tariffs a couple of weeks ago, suggesting that, in fact, this would not do well with Congress. You're already hearing from the Democrats that they will do whatever it takes to ensure that the 150-day rollover is not going to happen. It's going to be tough that close. Remember, so you're talking July 24th. It's going to be tough July 24th with an eye on the midterms to renew these tariffs. And there's still hope among some Republicans that, as the Wall Street Journal pleads, Trump takes the Supreme Court ruling as a gift to pause, to rethink, recalibrate. Of course, that's not going to happen. No one expects that to happen. I'm sure you're going to hear very strong language in the State of the Union tonight about the need for tariffs, how we're going broke as a country without them. Nonetheless, I don't see Congress, especially at that moment, before the midterms renewing. But
Okay.
anything is possible.
So they got 150 days with this 10% tariff, which itself might be subject to legal challenge and is a chance. Where would that legal challenge be? Would it be in the International Court of International Trade? Would it be at the appeals court? What would we look for to see even if this 10% tariff stays the course of the 150 days?
Well, the interesting question on who is participating in this decision kicks in with 122 because presumably, and some are arguing this, the IMF should have a say. Is the United States experiencing a fundamental balance of payments crisis? That could potentially also trigger an article under the WTO where other member countries could quiz at the WTO whether this is above board. Then you've got the question, would it go first to the Court of International Trade or would it go to a federal court? Remember, we had this question mark in the original filing against the IEEPA tariffs. And it was only when consolidation took place that we began with the Court of International Trade and then went on to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Similar questions will linger here. That's already in play. You're going to see the same protagonists filing, and my understanding is they have. Moreover, there is a class action lawsuit to get the tariff refund. That'll be interesting in its own right. Court of International Trade will loom large as the court of first instance for getting tariff refunds. Then we go to the other two tools. My concern with the other two tools, namely the enforcement mechanism called Section 301, as well as the national security mechanism called Section 232, these are probably a little cleaner legally, but they're worse politically. Because now you are making fundamental accusations against trade partners, and you are really risking the credibility of the executive by claiming that wooden bedroom furniture and bathroom vanities are national security items. So you're pressing within the Republican Party some devout free traders to side with tariffs that make very little sense on their face, but you're also riling foreign trade partners. And remember, the way that Trump gets around the claim that these tariffs are merely a consumption tax is by arguing, I'm getting good deals from foreign trade partners. Well, the EU has now called the US's bluff. You've got India delaying its visit to finalize the terms of a trade deal. They're saying, we're not ratifying anything until April at the earliest. You've got several other countries that are also beginning to wonder, is this even worth doing? Is there anything in the mix? And then let's not forget, the tariffs under Section 122, the balance of payments tariffs, will expire exactly at that moment when USMCA, the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, is supposed to be renewed. None of the timing is favorable for the Trump administration unless what it is willing to do is to come out and say, you got us. We are the protectionist populist regime that you always thought we were, and we really don't care what happens to the U.S. economy. This is how we're proceeding. Unless that is within reach, this is really bad timing and really bad optics, never mind the law.
But who could really stop the other waves of tariffs associated with the national security restrictions and the other sort of sections that these are presidential powers, right? What are the real constraints? They don't have to be approved by Congress. They do have to stand up presumably to legal scrutiny. So my guess is they're going to be fought in the courts, but that takes a long time. What are the things that are going to stop him from imposing tariffs on particular types of goods, even if they're bathroom vanities and things that don't necessarily clearly have a national security? But we all know that necessary logic is not the strongest motivator for some of the policy decisions that are being made at the moment.
The stock market, the bond market, the European Union, and China.
Okay.
It's real simple. It's real simple. The stock market responded really badly to the announcement that the 122 tariffs are going to go from 10 to 15%, and that Trump is entertaining the idea of import licenses and things that we in the United States largely deem to be non-tariff barriers. That is all a really scary, slippery slope. Every president is ultimately disciplined by bond markets. Watch 30-year Treasury yields go above 5%. You're going to see hell paid, both electorally as well as in terms of the reputation of the administration. And there is one big disciplining mechanism right there. It's been true for every president. Bond market, 5% yields and greater. the ultimate disciplining device. The big one, though, China is angry, the EU is angry. Remember, the reason Trump has largely been able to say that everyone was wrong about his tariffs is that we haven't witnessed massive retaliation for the tariffs yet. As soon as we do, then you're going to see big inflationary pressure, a lot of concerns. You're going to have exporters coming off the sidelines, big US companies getting their heads out of the sand and finally complaining and making sure that this narrative that foreign pays the tariff, not domestic, gets blown out of the water. Those would be my four disciplining mechanisms going forward.
Well, look, this is an SFS audience, and not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions about what this all means for the negotiation position with international treaties that or international agreements that Trump has been signed with a number of the bilateral players. You mentioned China, you mentioned the EU. So talk a little bit about sort of what is this uncertainty and continually challenging situation about sort of the future tariff regime? What is it going to mean for those agreements? And frankly, given the challenges that Trump is facing on this, one person asked, I think, a great question, which is what negotiating leverage is he really going to have, given that his credibility to stick to these tariffs is now being challenged externally?
It's going to come down to what businesses demand and what the electorate demands at the midterms. And fundamentally, there's a real irony at the moment. The trade deals that are being done with Malaysia, with Indonesia, with the EU, they're essentially in violation of all WTO and former trade objectives with respect to tariffs on the import side, but they're wildly rules based on the offense. In other words, the US is demanding that every country out there adhere to a rules-based system when handling American exports, especially with respect to their own non-tariff barriers. Think food safety, think technical specifications with respect to cars, think geographical indications and intellectual property. The US Malaysia text is chock full of WTO references. So we have this really weird moment where on the defense, we hate rules, and on the offense, we love rules. That gives foreign governments a lot of leverage against Trump because his sell, even though he dissolved his export council, which got almost no play and seems to be flying on the import side only, he needs to be able to show that there's benefits to these trade deals, not just that he's locking in Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam's concessions on US tariffs, but that we're also getting something on the offense. As soon as we lose the offense, though, those American companies are going to come and demand some kind of concession. And if Trump proves to be lacking any credibility in foreign negotiations, that is where you're going to get a lot of political pushback and ultimately some discipline in all of this. But I do believe Congress is going to begin to wake up and do something about reining this in because you've got too many sectoral and state level connections to particular trade partners where, like you're hearing today out of Maine, if these import barriers remain in place with respect to Canadian imports, Maine's got big problems. The more you hear that across US states, the more Trump is going to be boxed into a corner and he's going to have to walk back some of this. Not
Well, look,
all of it.
I'm going to ask you a quick question about refunds, and then I'm going to come back to the bigger issue of what this means ultimately for trade policy and for the balance of trade. But there are people out there in the audience who are in fact U.S. importers of record. What should they do on the refund side? Do they all have to start to file suits? Is it a class action suit that's going to impact them? What's the pathway on the refund story?
I'd love to say that there's going to be some class action case or that Customs and Border Protection is going to adhere to its system for liquidation and refund those things identified under IEPA categories for tariff codes. However, I'd go to the Court of International Trade. I'd get in queue. That's what I do as an American importer right now because it is unsettling to hear Trump say this could take 3 to 5 years. It is unsettling to hear Scott Bessent say that he's going to let the courts decide. The Department of Justice explained at the Court of Appeals, we have a process in place. They will be repaid with interest. And now to go from that to this is worrisome, to say the least. I'd go to the Court of International Trade. I'd be on record.
Okay, I want to ask really, I guess, a final question about the bigger story about America's trade policy and all of the implications of this remarkable sort of shift in tariff policy. We looked at the, trade deficit numbers just recently came out, and despite all of this, tremendous shift, it still hasn't made a dent in the trade deficit. So what's going on? Why is this not impacting the actual trade deficit?
Because as we teach in our first year econ course, tariffs don't redress trade deficits, savings and investment do. And the fact that this myth has been perpetuated thus far is really a testament to the fact that we don't have enough people going through econ courses to get the big picture. I got to tell you, I'm still surprised by how many people come up to me and they say, but I thought foreign is the one paying the tax. How are they getting refunded? Why should we refund them at all? I mean, this mythology has really caught on, and it's unnerving that it has. The truth is that we, like at SFS, have to do a better job bringing together all these different parts of the story. There's the law, there's the economics, and there's the politics. And the big picture requires all three. Remember what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said, we are here to rule on a very narrow issue of law, which is separation of powers. We have no competence to comment on economics or foreign policy. Now is the time for Congress to be shown what's really happening in terms of economics and foreign policy. Enough debating 122 versus 338 versus 301 versus 232. We get the statutes, all have their quirks, all have their guardrails. But the bigger picture going into the midterms is let's get the economics in front of the American people, and the politics will follow.
And look, you've engaged with some of the Trump folks who have been designing and thinking for both from Trump 1, the first term, and this term about trade policy. As you say, they were not surprised by the decision, they were preparing for it. But the path that you lay out is likely to still be a very, very difficult one, a very circuitous one with an enormous number of legal challenges. What you're sort of saying politically is you don't think he has the support of Congress to really push this through. You're thinking that there's going to be greater pushback from American industry. So how do you think Trump is going to respond? When he's constrained, he often lashes out even more. What do you see as the pathway of Trump's likely response to this very, very difficult tariff environment that the Supreme Court now has kind of put him in?
His advisors have to get with him and huddle around the idea that if he wants to play geopolitics and national security, which I don't think he does, I think this is just a tax grab. But get away from the tax grab, move on to national security. You want to put tariffs on semiconductors. You want to put tariffs on a couple of military related technologies, limit it that way. Do your Section 232s, maybe limit the Section 232s to things that you have a prima facie case that they are relevant to military technologies. Otherwise, we are in essence, creating the trade wars that his trade agreements are meant to solve. And there's no long run sustainable objective being pursued through that strategy right now. There's going to have to be, as the Wall Street Journal editorial board keeps pleading, some retrenchment, some backing off. He's never going to give up entirely on tariffs, but his tariffs have to be focused and moved into a direction that is more sustainable. And that is with respect to those industries that truly are national security.
And last question then would be where he's going to face the greatest possibility of trade wars, I assume would be with the EU and with China. What would you look for as their next step that will sort of signal that a trade war is coming?
Both of them have said over the past 48 hours that they have grave reservations about what they are seeing and what they are hearing. And the more that Trump freelances and tells us all the other tools that he can bring to bear, which are essentially embargo-esque, the more you're going to hear countries in the EU as well as China pushing back in a very dramatic way. It's in motion right now. And I just have to say that what has always struck me about the EU is their limited faith in any of this. The fact that they're enabling legislation, Article 2 of their enabling legislation offers three provisions to essentially retaliate the first hint that Trump isn't serious. And that's why you're seeing this pause on the part of the EU. China, I don't think we're going to get a lot of advance warning that they're going to hit back. And they are going to throttle American farmers in particular. That's going to be our first indication that China's hitting back. When there is an outright ban on US soy, you'll know the trade war with China has started. The EU will give us some advance warning, and the EU will leave a paper trail as it always does. Not so China. And my fear is Trump's reaction will be very bad, and he's not going to know on day one how to respond because he's not ascribed any agency to any other country in the trading system yet.
Well, look, Marc, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks again, as always, for your repeat performance in an important, complex, and set of issues that are really going to be shaping the remainder of the Trump administration, if not the remainder of the economy's performance over the next sort of few years. Appreciate it. Thank you all in SFS for joining us from around the world. I want to let you know that this conversation has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. And we will continue with SFS Fast Breaks. I want to finally really appreciate your reminder of the economics education that our SFS alums and students have had, because there are some core principles that you got from your international trade, you got from your IECO, you from your political economy and IPEC majors that should be helping you understand the implications of a lot of these issues. So it's great to be reminded of the relevance of the SFS education to the modern day issues that we're discussing at the moment. Thanks again, Marc. Thank you all for joining us. And we will see you again at the next Fast Break, which I assume is going to happen very, very soon, because there's a lot of issues on the table that are going to be important for us to discuss as we go forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you.